Sherlock Holmes was seated at the breakfast table. I stood on the hearthrug and picked up the stick our visitor had left behind him the night before. Just under the head was a broad silver band. Engraved on it was, "To James Mortimer, MRCS, from his friends of the CCH," with the date 1884. "Well, Watson, what do you make of it? Let me hear you reconstruct its owner." I followed, as far as I could, the methods of my companion. "I think that Dr. Mortimer is a successful, elderly medical man. He's well esteemed, since those who know him give him this mark of their appreciation." "Excellent," said Holmes. "I think also that he's probably a country practitioner who does a great deal of his visiting on foot." "Why so?" "First, because the iron ferrule is so worn down." "Perfectly sound," said Holmes. "And then there's the inscription, 'Friends of the CCH.' I'd guess that to be the something hunt, which places him in the country." "Really, Watson, you excel yourself," said Holmes. I must admit that I was proud to have mastered his system so far as to apply it in a way which earned his approval. He now took the stick. With an expression of interest, he carried it to the window and looked over it with a convex lens. "Interesting," he said, returning to his favourite corner of the settee. "I trust," I said, "there's nothing of consequence which I've overlooked." "I'm afraid, my dear Watson, that most of your conclusions were erroneous. Not that you're entirely wrong. The man is certainly a country practitioner, and he walks a good deal. But I'd suggest, for example, that a presentation to a doctor is more likely to come from a hospital than from a hunt, and that the initials CC naturally suggest Charing Cross." "You may be right," I admitted. Now, he couldn't have been on the staff of the hospital, since a country practitioner couldn't hold such a position. He could only have been a house doctor, little more than a senior student. And he left 5 years ago. The date's on the stick. So your grave, middle-aged family practitioner vanishes into thin air, my dear Watson, and there emerges a young fellow under 30, the possessor of a favourite dog, which I should describe as larger than a terrier and smaller than a mastiff." I laughed incredulously. "As to the latter part," I said, "I've no means of checking, but at least it's not difficult to find out a few particulars about the man's age and professional career." I took down the medical directory and turned up the name. There were several Mortimers, but only one who could be our visitor. I read his record aloud. "Mortimer, James, MRCS, 1882, Grimpen, Dartmoor, Devon. House surgeon, 1882 to 1884, at Charing Cross Hospital." Holmes smiled. "No mention of that local hunt, Watson, but a country doctor, as you very astutely observed. And the dog has been in the habit of carrying this stick behind his master. The marks of his teeth are plain. The dog's jaw, as shown in the space between these marks, is too broad for a terrier and not broad enough for a mastiff. It may have been— Yes, by Jove, it is, a curly-haired spaniel." He'd risen and paced the room as he spoke. Now he halted in the recess of the window. I glanced up in surprise. "My dear fellow, how can you possibly be so sure of that?" "For the very simple reason that I see the dog himself on our very doorstep, and there is the ring of its owner." Our visitor was a tall, thin man with keen grey eyes set closely together and sparkling from behind a pair of gold-rimmed glasses. Though young, he walked with a forward thrust of his head. As he entered, his eyes fell upon the stick in Holmes's hand, and he ran towards it. "I'm so very glad. I wasn't sure whether I'd left it here or in the shipping office. I wouldn't lose that stick for the world." Sherlock Holmes waved our visitor into a chair. "Mr. Holmes," said Dr. James Mortimer, "I'm suddenly confronted with a most serious and extraordinary problem. I have in my pocket a manuscript." "I observed it," said Holmes. protruding from your breast pocket as you entered the room. Dr. Mortimer drew it forth. Its date is 1742. This family paper was committed to my care by Sir Charles Baskerville, whose sudden and tragic death some 3 months ago created so much excitement in Devonshire. With your permission, I'll read it to you." Holmes leaned back in his chair, placed his fingertips together, and closed his eyes. Of the origin of the Hound of the Baskervilles, there have been many statements. Yet I come in a direct line from Hugo Baskerville, and I had the story from my father, who also had it from his. Know then that in the time of the Great Rebellion, this manor of Baskerville was held by Hugo of that name, a wild, profane, and godless man. It chanced that this Hugo came to love the daughter of a yeoman who held lands near the Baskerville estate, but the young maiden would ever avoid him. It came to pass that one Michaelmas, the maid's father and brothers being from home, this Hugo, with 5 of his companions, stole down upon the farm and carried her off. When they had brought her to the hall, the maiden was placed in an upper chamber, but while Hugo and his companions were carousing, she made her escape. When Hugo discovered her departure, he saddled his mare and unkennelled his pack. Giving the hounds a kerchief of the maid's, he swung them in full cry over the moor. His companions galloped after. They had gone a mile when they passed one of the night shepherds. They cried to him to know if he had seen the hunt. The man said that he had indeed seen the unhappy maiden with the hounds upon her track. "But I have seen more than that, for Hugo Baskerville passed me upon his black mare, and there ran mute behind him such a hound of hell as God forbid should ever be at my heels." Soon they came upon a clearing, and there in the centre lay the unhappy maid, dead of fear and fatigue. It was not, however, the sight of her body, nor yet that of Hugo Baskerville lying near her, which raised the hair upon their heads, but standing over Hugo, and plucking at his throat, stood a great black beast, shaped like a hound, yet larger than any hound mortal eye had rested upon. Even as they looked, the thing tore the throat out of Hugo Baskerville. As it turned its blazing eyes and dripping jaws upon them, the 5 shrieked with fear and rode for dear life, still screaming across the moor. Such is the tale of the coming of the hound, which has plagued the family ever since. For it cannot be denied that many of the family have been unhappy in their deaths, which have been sudden, bloody, and mysterious. So, my sons, I counsel you to forbear from crossing the moor in those dark hours when the powers of evil are exalted. When Dr. Mortimer had finished reading this singular narrative, he drew a folded newspaper out of his pocket. "Now, Mr. Holmes, this is the Devon County Chronicle of May the 14th. I read. The recent death of Sir Charles Baskerville has cast a gloom over the country. The facts are simple. Sir Charles was a widower, and his indoor servants consisted of a married couple named Barrymore. Sir Charles was in the habit, before going to bed, of walking down the famous yew alley of Baskerville Hall. On the 4th of May, Sir Charles had declared his intention of starting next day for London. That night he went out as usual for his walk. He never returned. At 12 o'clock, Barrymore, finding the hall door still open, became alarmed and went in search of his master. The day had been wet, and Sir Charles's footmarks were easily traced. Halfway down the alley, a gate leads out onto the moor. Sir Charles seemed to have stood here for some time. He then proceeded down the alley, and it was at the far end that his body was discovered. One unexplained fact is Barrymore's statement that his master's footprints changed after he passed the moor gate. After that, he appeared to have been walking upon his toes. No signs of violence were discovered upon Sir Charles. Though the doctor's evidence pointed to an almost incredible facial distortion, it was explained that this is a symptom not unusual in death from cardiac exhaustion. This was borne out by the post-mortem examination, which showed long-standing organic disease. The next of kin is Mr. Henry Baskerville, the son of Sir Charles Baskerville's younger brother. The young man, when last heard of, was in America, and inquiries are being instituted. Dr. Mortimer replaced the paper in his pocket. "This case," said Sherlock Holmes, "certainly presents some features of interest. If those are the public facts, let me have the private ones." "Well," said Dr. Mortimer, "I saw a good deal of Sir Charles Baskerville. With the exception of Mr. Frankland of Lafter Hall and Mr. Stapleton, the naturalist, there are no other men of education within many miles. Within the last few months it became increasingly plain to me that Sir Charles was strained to breaking point. He'd taken this legend exceedingly to heart, so much so that nothing would induce him to go out upon the moor at night. He was convinced that a dreadful fate overhung his family. It was at my advice that Sir Charles was about to go to London. I thought that a few months among the distractions of town would send him back a new man. At the last instant came this terrible catastrophe. Barrymore, the butler, who discovered Sir Charles's body, immediately sent for me, and I reached Baskerville Hall within an hour of the event. I checked and corroborated all the facts which were mentioned at the inquest. Barrymore said that there were no traces upon the ground round the body. He didn't observe any, but I did, some little distance off, but fresh and clear. Footprints? Footprints. A man's or a woman's? Dr. Mortimer's voice sank almost to a whisper. Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic